All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Frank Lee. I'm a graduate student at UC Berkeley. And today, let's talk about security patches and some of the vulnerabilities that they fix. So year after year, we find thousands and thousands of new vulnerabilities. We find so many that we've started this recent habit of branding some of them with alluring names and logos. So here I show just the logos for a handful of these branded vulnerabilities. We have one that happens to have CCS in the name, but of course it stands for something different. We have the crack vulnerability, which was presented here just like 24 hours ago and won a best paper. And in fact, we now have even so many of these branded vulnerabilities that you might not have realized that one of these logos is not even real. But I'll let you try and figure that out, and if you're curious at the end, feel free to ask. Now, with so many vulnerabilities that we constantly discover, branded or not, we end up constantly having to patch our software code bases. This leaves our end users and our system administrators constantly running on the so-called patching treadmill, where they have to apply software update after software update with these security patches to protect themselves against the flood of newly discovered vulnerabilities. Now, given the central role that these security patches and that this patching treadmill plays in our management of vulnerabilities, it behooves us to better understand the security patches themselves as well as the process by which they're developed. So to that end, there are a lot of interesting and important questions, such as for the vulnerabilities that are fixed by the patches, how long did they live in the code bases for? How timely are the security patches developed, say relative to public disclosure? How reliable are those patches at fixing the vulnerabilities, and do they potentially introduce new problems themselves? And finally, are these security patches just similar to other types of bug fixes, or are they characteristically different, their own type of beast? So answering questions like these can provide us with insights and directions for moving forward in improving how we better manage security vulnerabilities. Now, do we already have answers to these questions? To kind of address that, let me briefly survey the space of prior work. So here we can look at prior work along essentially two different dimensions, and this is kind of a high-level generalization. So on one axis is, I'm sure a word that I made up, but hopefully it'll get the point across, but securityness. How focused is this work on security aspects, such as security patches? And the reason why we care specifically about security patches is given their important role in securing software and the time sensitivity of their development. Along the other axis is scale. And an important, particularly important aspect of scale is the diversity of software considered. There's a lot of value in looking at a small handful of projects, doing a really deep dive into them and getting some good insights. But then there's always a question of how well those insights generalize to other types of software and other types of projects. So having a very diverse set of projects also has a lot of value for generating generalizable insights. So at the bottom here, we have work that I'm just going to generalize as saying is from the software engineering community. It's not all from there, but a bulk of it is from there. And these are works that focus on bug fixes in general or other types of bug fixes. Now, we, though, care specifically about security patches, and there are a handful of projects, papers that do look at security patches, although most of them operate at a restricted scale, where they look at a small handful of projects and, again, do a deep dive into them. So in this study, we try and explore this gap in the picture, which is to take this broader perspective, looking at a large number of security patches across a large number of projects, with an aim of providing generalizable insights to some of the questions that I posed earlier. So to do such a study, we naturally need a lot of data, so where do we get it? So at a high level, there are essentially three steps in our data collection process. The first is to find vulnerabilities and information about them. The second is to get the security patches that fix these vulnerabilities, and we'll also aim to get the source code as well, because that just provides a lot more data beyond what's in the security patches themselves. And our final step will be to try and collect a data set of general bug fixes so that we can tease apart the differences between security patches and bug fixes in general. So let's take a look at the details. Let's dive into the details of it. So to find vulnerabilities, we have a great data set, which many people use, which is the NIST National Vulnerability Database, or NVD for short. This is a database that aims to curate all publicly known vulnerabilities and has extensive documentation about those vulnerabilities. So let's take a look at what's inside the database for a given vulnerability. There's an entry for each of them, and each is assigned this CVE identifier, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. There's also a publication date, which is when this entry was published to the database. There's a bunch of annotations about the vulnerabilities, such as its severity, its vulnerability category, products affected, and so on. And finally, there are also external references that point to other web pages with information relevant to the vulnerability. So for this study, we collected a snapshot of the NVD on December 26, 2016. So we have data up till then, and perhaps you can infer what I was doing over winter break last year. All right, so there's a lot of great information, but there's a particular piece of information here that could be further refined, and that's this publication date. So as I mentioned earlier, this publication date is really when this entry was added to the database, but not necessarily when the vulnerability was actually publicly disclosed. And that's a very important date to understand in the vulnerability management process. So we wanted to see if we could get a better estimate for the disclosure date, and we do this through looking at some of these external references. We noticed that a lot of these point to web pages with public information about the vulnerability and a publication date. So we can approximate when information was released about the particular vulnerability. So by crawling and trying to parse out these publication dates from some of these web pages, we can better estimate the first public mention discussing the vulnerability. But these web pages don't just give you the dates, rather you have to parse it out yourself. So for each domain or each type of web page, we have to have a manual parser or manually create a parser that parses it out. So we focus on the top 20 domains, and these contain web pages for security advisories, email discussions in public mailing lists, public forums, sometimes other vulnerability databases, and the like. So we crawled these and parsed out these publication dates, and we picked the earliest in comparison with the CVE publication date as our estimated date of disclosure, and that's what we use for that. So this is a fair amount of effort. Is it worth anything? Is it a waste of time? Well, for 8% of the CVEs, we found actually no improvement in our estimate. But for the rest, the median improvement was 27 days, so nearly a month. And we actually saw extreme discrepancies in some cases, such as up to 3 years. This was a vulnerability in FreeRDP that, for whatever reason, was just not published to the NVD for 3 years, even though it was publicly discussed on public forums and email lists 3 years earlier. So here, we can get a much more refined estimate of the public disclosure date. And now we have just a bunch of information about the vulnerabilities. The next step is to try and collect the security patches that actually fix these vulnerabilities, as well as the project source code. So again, we just have a lot more data to work with besides what's in the patches themselves. To do this, we again leverage these external references, which are really just this rich data set. We notice that a lot of these entries have links to web interfaces for version-controlled software repositories, and Git is by far the most common in our data set and arguably overall. So we can, but these links don't only point to a Git web interface, but they actually point to a specific commit. And to illustrate what I mean there, here's an example reference for the OpenSSL GitHub repository. We can actually see that there's a specific commit reference in this URL with the commit hash. And then we also know where the repository is located based off the URL, but in some cases you might have to crawl the web interfaces to find out where the repo is actually hosted. Just a small tidbit, this is actually the commit that fixed the Heartbleed bug. So we don't just do github.com, but we also do other popular Git web interfaces such as cgit, GitLab, and GitWeb. We crawl those, find the location of the repositories, and keep track of all of these commit hashes that we see. And in total, we sucked down over 4,000 commits for 3,000 vulnerabilities across 682 projects. And I say 682 unique projects here because we do deduplicate mirrored versions of the same project. So at this point, you might be thinking, all right, good job, Frank. You have a bunch of commits. What are they? So when we do a manual inspection of a random sample of these, we actually find that all of them are security patches, which indicates that this data set should be largely, if not all, associated with security patches. So this is how we collect that data set of these fixes for our vulnerabilities. The final step in our general data, or in our data collection pipeline, is to try and get a data set of general bug fixes. And this is, again, so that we can tease apart the differences between security patches and bug fixes in general. Now, the data set that we've collected so far lacks any reliable annotations for what's a bug fix and what's not a bug fix, so we go along the machine learning route. So we start with a training data set of 400 manually labeled commits that are randomly sampled from these repositories, and we label them as bug fixes or not bug fixes. Then we train a classifier. Specifically, we use a logistic regression that models the character n-grams in the Git commit messages. I'm going to leave the details of the training and the classifier parameters for the paper, but our accuracy was roughly 90%. And then we use this classifier to collect a data set of mostly bug fixes, where we randomly select commits per repository, classifying as bug fix or not, and we collect up to 10 bug fixes per repository. And this gives us a total data set of over 6,000 general bug fixes. So at this point, we have a data set of vulnerabilities, a bunch of security patches, as well as bug fixes in general. And we can start to dive into this data and try and provide some insights or answers to the questions that I posed at the beginning of the talk. Of course, this here I'm going to present just a subset of our results, one that I find are more interesting, but please see the paper for the full set. So the first thing that you might think of when you discover a vulnerability or you hear about a vulnerability is how long did it live in the code base? Now we can tell when a vulnerability died, so to say, based on when the security patch was committed to the repository. Unfortunately, it's pretty challenging to automatically determine when the vulnerability was born at scale, given the number of vulnerabilities we have, the different types of vulnerabilities, and the diversity of software. So instead, we use this rough birth estimation, which is we look at the code that's modified by the security patch, and we look at when it was last modified beforehand. So essentially, if you're familiar with Git, this is like git blame. And the intuition behind this is that there's some bad portion of the code that has the vulnerability in the software, and the patch is going to change that. So as long as that bad code hasn't been changed before that patch, the software should still be vulnerable. Now, there are two aspects of this estimation to think about, though. The first is whether that assumption is actually accurate, that the code that's being touched by the patch actually contains the vulnerability. And in the paper, we discussed an assessment that shows that this is actually a robust assumption. The second is that this is really a lower bound estimate, because there could have been some other commit that touched the same code for whatever reason, but the vulnerability was already there. So really, we're underestimating the lifespan of the vulnerability when we look at the birth to time of death. But still, this provides a conservative lower bound and gives us some insight into how long the lifespans might be. So for 3,000 vulnerabilities, when we look at the birth and death of these vulnerabilities, the median was approximately 15 months, and a third of them lived for more than 3 years. And remember, this is likely an underestimate in many cases. We also have this 21-year-old beauty that was in an unsafe read in Kerberos. And I did manually validate that indeed it is 21 years old. So here we see that vulnerabilities live for a substantial amount of time in code bases on the order of years, which speaks to a need for improved testing and auditing of our open source projects. Now, another aspect of the patch development process is the timeliness that patch was developed relative to, say, public disclosure. And one important question is, for vulnerabilities that are disclosed, what fraction of them are actually still unpatched at time of disclosure? Fortunately, we see that this happens for 21% of the vulnerabilities, so roughly a fifth of our vulnerabilities. And a quarter of them actually still remain unfixed more than a month after public disclosure. This is obviously a bad situation because the information is out there about the vulnerability, and attackers might be able to leverage it, but users don't have a patch yet to protect themselves against. And I will say that in the paper, we do an analysis of this correlated with severity, and there are high severity vulnerabilities in this data set. This is not just little rinky-dink vulnerabilities that nobody cares about. If we flip this time in the relative direction and look at the roughly 80% of vulnerabilities that were patched by disclosure, another question is how far in advance was that security patch visible in the project repository? We see that a median was 2 weeks, and that a quarter of them, so roughly 20% of vulnerabilities overall, were committed about 3 months prior to public disclosure. Now, you might be wondering, okay, why does this matter? This seems like the good thing because they fixed the vulnerability before disclosure. The issue here is this is a quantification of a threat that we've always known was there for open source projects, which is that an attacker or an adversary can monitor a Git repository, see these security patches, try and figure out what the vulnerability was, and exploit it in the wild before there's any widespread dissemination about that vulnerability. And we see here the attackers get a head start of on the order of weeks to months of a jump start in terms of trying that particular attack. So this indicates that coordinated disclosure and the embargoing of information when it comes to public disclosure is a really hot topic, but the visibility of patch should at least be part of the discussion, and I'll touch on that at the end. So the final aspect of the patch development process that I want to briefly touch on is patch reliability, which is the question of how often are patches problematic. And patches can be problematic in multiple ways. One way is that they can be incomplete in that they don't fully address the vulnerability, and they still require some subsequent fix to actually fully remediate the situation. The other is that the patch can itself be regressive, that they introduce a new bug or hurt the functionality in the software itself. Now, it's very difficult to automatically determine if the patch itself is problematic. If we did, we would have a very different paper on how to build safe and reliable patches, and I'm obviously talking about something different here. So we go kind of an estimation route, which I'm going to provide an overview here, but the paper has the details. So we start by trying to find vulnerabilities with multiple commits. The intuition here is that if there are multiple commits, then one of the follow-on commits might be fixing an issue introduced by the first commit. Now, we do this in two ways. The first is to just look at the database and see if there are multiple commits in there. The second is that we look at the history in the source code repository, so specifically the Git logs, for Git commit messages that reference the specific CVE ID or reference the original patch's commit hash. So certainly this will not find all vulnerabilities with multiple commits, but rather just a subset that have this explicit linkage. Once we have these, we try and filter them down because not all CVEs with multiple commits are necessarily bad. Obviously, a developer might have just split a patch over multiple commits, but usually you do so in a short period. It's a little weird to push the first part of a commit and then push the second part like a year later. So we filter out CVEs with all commits in a small time window. The paper discusses our assessment of looking at the distribution of time and was a good cutoff, and we chose a 24-hour between two subsequent patches. And we filter these out as less likely to be problematic. And finally, we would ideally manually inspect all of the things that remain, but manually inspecting each patch actually takes quite a lot of effort because you got to see, is there a problem, and if so, what exactly was the problem? And it requires a good amount of manual analysis. So the number of CVEs we had left over was still too many, so we randomly sampled and did manually inspected that random sample. So in this study, we had 440 CVEs that remained after filtering, and we randomly sampled 50 of them for manual analysis. So this table here summarizes the results of our manual analysis. We saw that 52%, so over half of our vulnerabilities, had an incomplete patch, where it required a subsequent commit to actually fix the original patch because it didn't actually fully address the vulnerability. Over a third, or I should say roughly a third, had a regressive patch where there was a subsequent commit that had to fix some new issue introduced by the original patch. And then 28% had some benign commit, such as code refactoring, additional documentation, testing code, something benign. And the reason why this doesn't add up to 100% is actually because there are vulnerabilities that have multiple commits in multiple categories. So this is a random sample of 50 commits, but it's representative of the population it was sampled for, which is 440 CVEs. That's 15% of all CVEs that we're looking at. So if you were to extrapolate these results to all of the CVEs in our data set, we conclude, or we estimate that over 7% of vulnerabilities have an incomplete patch and over 5% have regressive. And total is roughly 10% of vulnerabilities have some sort of problematic patch. Now, this is actually likely a lower bound for two reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, we don't find all vulnerabilities that had multiple commits because we're only looking for ones that have that explicit linkage. So there are others out there that may have had problematic patches which aren't even in our data set here. The other is that the more recent vulnerabilities in our data set may have had patches that were very recent, and hence, during our analysis, they had not yet manifested as actually problematic. So there are more that could be there. So this is likely a lower bound. So clearly, this indicates that our ability to build safe and reliable patches is far from complete. So the final aspect I want to discuss about our results is a comparison of security patches versus general bug fixes along with some patch characteristics. So one question is how security and general bug fixes differ in size. Size can be measured in a lot of different metrics. A very simple one is the number of line changes in the patch itself, essentially the size of the diff. So we see that the median size for a security patch is 7 lines of code, whereas for general bug fixes, it's about 16 lines, which is more than twice as high. When you look at other size metrics, which we discussed in our paper, we still end up with the same conclusion, which is that security patches tend to be smaller than other bug fixes. Another characteristic to look at is the locality of the changes being made by each type of patch. And we can look at this at two granularities. Excuse me. The first is source file granularity. And we see that 70% of security patches change only one source code file compared to 55% of bug fixes. When we look at the function granularity, we see that 60% change a single function compared to 42% of bug fixes. So overall, security patches tend to be more localized in their changes and smaller than bug fixes in general. Of course, this is somewhat of a coarse-grained analysis since we're not splitting apart the general bug fixes into different categories, but this might be a characteristic of security patches which can be leveraged in the future. So speaking of the future and moving forward, I wanted to conclude by discussing some of the future work that can be done in the space, as well as some of the implications of our findings. So as I when I was talking about prior work, I stated that this was really an initial exploration of security patches at a diverse scale of software projects. And I think there's a lot of really interesting exploration that can still be done. We only do a handful in this paper, and there's a lot more that can be done. For example, how do our findings differ across different types of projects or different types of organizations and their behaviors? Does code reviewing practices change some of these findings? Or do different code reviewing practices change these findings? I think there's also interesting work in leveraging the properties that we noted about security patches, that they tend to be smaller and more localized. For example, the software engineering community has recently done some cool work on automatic program repair, but a recent survey study actually found that the majority of general bug fixes tend to be too complex to be suitable for their techniques. So perhaps security patches being more localized and smaller might be more amenable, and that's something worth investigating. So I think there's a lot of rich research directions to move forward in. Now, our findings on the advantage that attackers can get by monitoring Git repositories and just looking for these patches to find the vulnerabilities indicates that the visibility of the security patch should be part of the coordinated disclosure process. And the coordinated disclosure process and embargoing of patches is a very hotly debated topic, but there are organizations that would consider and do consider embargoing security patches. For example, the Microsoft Offensive Security team recently had an interesting blog post where they discussed the management of a security vulnerability reported to them in their open source Chakra JavaScript engine. And they explicitly stated in the blog that they decided to embargo their patch, essentially not commit the patch to the repository until it was coordinated with public disclosure and the distribution of the software update. Now, naturally, this kind of behavior might not be suitable for all organizations, especially those that projects that operate in a very distributed fashion. And this does operate a little bit against the normal flow of open source development, but it is a policy to potentially consider to protect users from this potential threat. The final thing I want to discuss is that our results show a clear need for more extensive code testing and auditing, although we know we always need more of this. But we saw that vulnerabilities lived in code bases for a significant duration, and that when we do try and fix it, a non-trivial fraction of the patches themselves end up being problematic. Now, the transparency of open source projects naturally lends itself to a lot more testing and auditing from the community aspect, and there have been really good efforts to that end. For example, we've had a lot of recent audits about core libraries or crypto libraries that have really helped harden them. And there have been efforts such as the Core Infrastructure Initiative and Google's OSS Fuzz project, which just constantly fuzzes critical open source software, which has found a lot of vulnerabilities and have really helped improve the security of those software. So with efforts like that, I think we can move towards an improved and more secure open source ecosystem to protect users better. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, great work. Oliver Schranz from CISPA. Cool. My question concerns this patch locality. So in the very beginning, you had this as a way to detect or to assess the birth of a vulnerability,
Mhm.
just that you actually showed in the paper that is kind of robust, and later also in the statistics. So I'm interested in cases where developers actually did not implement fixes, but mitigations. So the easiest example would be they did not fix a vulnerability, but have a filter. For example, just drop some
Ah.
input arguments and so on, the kind of quick fixes. So in your research, did you encounter a lot of those, and do you think those have a meaningful impact on the research?
That's a fantastic question. So no, we didn't actually look at those patches in too much detail. I mean, we have like 4,000 patches across all these different projects, and to really understand the patches requires a good semantic understanding of each project and what the patch is doing. It's a fascinating question though, because as you said, this might just be a mitigation just to fix it quickly, and then people will try and or a subsequent patch will really fix that. I would argue that's not necessarily the behavior we want, though, because we already know that getting people to update software itself is already problematic. So if we need to have multiple updates in order for them to fix a single vulnerability, that can be that may not be as effective. But of course, in some cases, maybe we have to mitigate it first because we don't know quite how to resolve it. For example, some of these crypto vulnerabilities might require some immediate fix that at least makes people less vulnerable, but then we need to fix it at the core later. We didn't look at this. This is a fascinating area to look at. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Mm,
Hi, great talk. I was wondering when you were describing the machine learning part,
mhm,
right? So to do the classifier, I was wondering what are the features that you are looking into the commits to try to decide,
mhm.
if it's a bug fix or is it a security vulnerability?
Yeah, so I admit I went over it very quickly, so I apologize for that, but the talk is relatively short. So we looked at the n-grams in the git commit messages. So you take the git commit message, you split it up into n-grams, and then it was just logistic regression claimed on the presence or absence of certain n-grams to signal that this was a bug fix or not bug fix. We did actually try using other features, such as the time that this patch was developed, day of the week, things like that. And we very briefly discussed in the paper, but essentially we actually didn't find more discriminative power using those features.
What
But of
what
course, yep.
what was the confidence that you got when once machine learning classifies something? What was the confidence?
So overall, our average. So we did a tenfold cross validation. Our average recall, if I remember correctly, was 82%, and our average precision was 91%. So it's not a terribly accurate classifier. It's actually surprisingly good, given it's a relatively simple classifier and it's a relatively small training data set. But in our analysis, we actually basically we don't aim to look at specific general bug fixes because we know there might be some false positives. So rather, we look at the overall distributions and we see that the size of the effects that we notice are too large to be accounted by the fraction of false positives that our machine learning classifier might have. And additionally, we have actually more confidence in our classifier results, or at least that the distributions are representative because we do have hand-labeled bug fixes. So for like the size metrics, locality metrics that I talked about, we actually do compute the distribution of that on our manually labeled bug fixes,
No.
and we compare that with our classifier outputs, and we see that they're roughly equivalent.
All right,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yep.
Ada Lerner, Wellesley
Thank you.
College. Great talk, great
Thanks.
work.
Mhm.
I'm curious about the size and locality and whether they correlate with other characteristics of the commits. Like, I'm wondering, like,
Mhm.
do bug fixes that required a large patch, or do security fixes that required a large patch take longer for someone to write a patch for them, and those kinds
Mhm.
of questions. So,
That
did you look at that?
that those are exactly the kind of questions that I kind of thought were future work. We didn't look at it in this one, but I think it's very interesting. There has been some work in the software engineering community that has looked at aspects of this. For example, there is this paper that found that larger bug fixes, larger commits in general, were more likely to have bug fixes. I guess it's somewhat intuitive, but we could apply the same thing for these security patches, and that could be also very insightful as well. But work to do in the future.
Could also be interesting to see whether people get large patches wrong more often,
Yeah,
right?
that
Because you also know
exactly.
about that. So,
Yeah.
cool. Thank you.
Yep. Great. Yeah. So just to repeat the question, it's did we consider essentially the popularity of the projects or I guess the implications of the bug fix? With regards to the implications of the bug fix, we do look at how things correlate to severity as graded by CBSS, which is the standard in NVD. So that might be a rough proxy for impact. In terms of the popularity of the projects, we do a demographic breakdown of like what are the different types of projects that we get. And we do some aggregation by the projects, but we don't look at the correlation between the popularity. But certainly something interesting to look at in the future as well. Yep. All right. Thanks a lot, guys.